We've gotten to a point where we no longer have a consensus around our democratic process.
Tonight on a Newsy special, Election 22, America at a crossroad, the state of democracy heading into the November midterms and beyond. The impacts of the Capitol insurrection and the rhetoric that led to it. Plus, election deniers running for key positions that oversee your vote.
The implications are huge. Election security is not about when one party wins all the time.
And what changes to voting laws you need to know about. Plus, presidential approval ratings, a drag for Democrats?
Which party is in control of the White House tends to lose seats in a midterm election.
The messaging on both sides of the aisle and what issues seem to be resonating with voters.
I'm really, scared at the way we've been going.
Election 22, America at a crossroad, starts now. Good evening, I'm Jay Strubberg.
And I'm Lindsay Tuchman. Welcome to this Newsy special, Election 22, America at a Crossroad.
Over the next hour, we're looking at the state of American democracy, how both parties, the current administration, the former president, and an attack on the nation's capital have all shaped the political landscape as we quickly approach the pivotal midterm elections. A live look now at Capitol Hill tonight, where Republicans and Democrats are jockeying for the balance of power in Congress. The midterms on November 8th. Now, just 72 days away. This picture you're seeing now, much different than the chaotic scene we saw on January 6th, 2021.
Because that person is a speed circle, breach the line. We need backup. We need to hold the doors of the Capitol. I need parents' support.
These were great people. The crowd was unbelievable. And I mentioned the word love, the love in the air. I've never seen anything like it.
Sobering video. A mob of supporters of then-President Donald Trump violently storming the Capitol in protest of lawmakers certifying Joe Biden's legitimate victory in the 2020 presidential election.
That Capitol insurrection and the baseless conspiracies about voter fraud continue to permeate political discourse, further deepening concerns over the health of American democracy going forward.
Our democracy remains in danger. The conspiracy to thwart the will of the people is not over.
Our Constitution, the structure of our institutions, and the rule of law, which are at the heart of what makes America great, are at stake.
After the deadly insurrection unfolded, 147 Republican members of the House and Senate objected to certifying the election. Members of the party promoted Trump's false claims of a stolen election, claims that continue to this day.
And to be clear, President Biden's election victory was fair and legitimate. Several legal challenges to the results failed in state and federal courts, and of the numerous audits conducted at multiple levels of government by both Democrats and Republicans, none turned up any evidence that an election was compromised.
But election denial and former President Donald Trump himself are front and center in American politics, especially in key Republican primary races across the country. Newsy congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed shows us how those who defied Trump and their own party are paying political consequences.
It's no secret that President Trump looms large in the 2022 midterms, punishing the Republicans who defied him and rewarding his most faithful supporters.
Obviously, we're all very grateful to President Trump.
But a key question heading into November is whether the former president's many controversies could hurt Republicans in a year that history suggests should be good for them.
I talked to people in Pennsylvania where I'm from. I talked to people from Ohio where I worked for the local congressman for a while. And people just aren't that interested in what's going on, on these partisan-run committee hearings. I think right now, and we hear it again and again, it's inflation, inflation, inflation.
But a recent NBC News poll found 21% of registered voters said threats to democracy are now their top issue, overshadowing concerns about the economy, inflation, and immigration. And 57% said they want investigations into the former president to continue. But they've come with a price for some in the GOP. Of the 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, most will not be returning in the 118th Congress next year. Of the 8 not returning, 4 are retiring, including January 6th committee member Adam Kinzinger, and 4 have lost their primaries, including January 6th committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney earlier this month to a Trump-backed challenger. Just 2 were successful in their primaries against challengers to the right earlier this year.
Lisa, Lisa.
The one Republican senator to vote to convict Trump and face voters in 2022, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, also survived her primary, but will still face off against a Trump-backed challenger in the general election.
I think really what the November elections are going to come down to is how local each candidate is able to make their race. I think when most candidates are out there on the ground talking to voters, they're talking about kitchen table issues. They're not necessarily litigating what the former president may or may not have been accused of.
But just a few months out from the 2022 midterms, some Republican Senate candidates are struggling. Trump endorsed Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, Herschel Walker in Georgia, and Ron Johnson in Wisconsin are all lagging in recent polls behind their Democratic challengers. But over in the House of Representatives, Republicans could still be poised to win and are likely to get rid of the January 6th committee should they take control of the chamber next January. Nathaniel Reed, Newsy, Washington.
Joining us now is Uriel Epstein. He's the executive director of the Renew Democracy Initiative, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Uriel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tell us, in your opinion, what is the level of danger, perhaps, that U.S. democracy is in right now, and how concerned are you about the direction it's heading?
Thank you so much for having me on. The danger is significant, and so I'm actually incredibly worried about the state of American democracy, which is true, unfortunately, for the vast majority of Americans. And that means people on both the left and the right. Right, you have majorities on both sides terrified about the future of democracy, but of course for very different reasons. And so what I'm most concerned about is that a lot of people seem to be buying into this false narrative about how fragile our elections are, to the point that, Biden is not the legitimately elected president, that he stole the election. And the very fact that these beliefs are so prevalent is something that is incredibly dangerous in a democracy, because our system is predicated upon the understanding that a loser of an election will recognize the winner's legitimacy and simply try again next time. And if we don't have that, then that's something that's incredibly I think an incredible risk to our nation. And, I'll go one step further and say that the thing that I'm most concerned about is that we should be having these discussions about the system of our democracy right now, even more than any single individual policy. The example that I offer is that I happen to, as an individual, personally disagree with President Biden's loan forgiveness program. But that has nothing to do with the state of American democracy. And therefore, again, I purely as an American citizen, as an individual, will be voting on questions related to defending that system rather than this or that economic policy that I might prefer.
Uriel, President Biden did deliver some very direct comments about the issue of democracy in a speech last month. I want to play a clip of that right now.
You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-democracy. You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-American.
You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-democracy. Those are obviously some pretty strong words. But aside from that, is the president, are Democratic lawmakers doing enough to call attention to the future of democracy? Are they being too quiet about it?
They are absolutely being too quiet about it, but not only are they being too quiet about it, they're actually doing harm in some cases. The DCCC has put hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, kind of surreptitiously behind very far-right Trumpist candidates in the hopes that they would win in the Republican primary and serve as a weaker candidate for the Democrat to oppose in the general. And I just can't imagine how dangerous that policy is. And the very fact that they're not only considering it, but acting upon it is, I think, a testament to how people aren't taking the safety of our system, they are taking the safety of our system for granted. Representative Peter Meyer is not someone that Democrats should have been seeking to defeat in his own primary by supporting his more extremist Republican. As a candidate, Representative Meyer voted for impeachment. He's one of the relatively few folks in that area who has actually been strong. And for Democrats to punish him for it seems to be sending a very dangerous message.
And real quick, we're, of course, approaching midterm elections, and then there's next 2024 coming up as well, and many politicians have called these next elections the most important of our lives. You may argue that 2020 was perhaps more important, or even 2016. In your mind, what can you put into perspective what's at stake this upcoming November and how monumental it could be?
What's at stake this November is not any single policy. It's not passing some particular economic or social policy. It is instead about defining the rules of the road. The people that are elected to Congress in 2022, that are elected to the House, will play a significant role in setting the stage for the presidential election of 24. And not only Congress, I should know, but also in local and state levels. And so this election is going to be critical, less so, I would argue, because of any policy implications, but more importantly, because of the impact it'll have on how the presidential election will be perceived and how it will actually be implemented, how it will actually be run. And if there's even a whiff of, people trying to pursue the big lie, right? This idea that the election was stolen in 2020. If they try to pursue that argument in 2024, I really can't predict whether or not our system could survive that.
Very grim thought there. Uriel Epstein with the Renew Democracy Initiative. As always, a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you so much.
For more perspective on the Republican Party, let's bring in John Hart. He's a GOP strategist and co-founder of C3 Solutions, a conservative climate organization. John, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. What direction do you see your party going in, especially when it comes to former President Donald Trump and the conspiracies about the last election?
Well, it's great to be on. Well, look, the direction of the Republican Party is a complicated question. I would say, what we have to do is step back, and if the Republican Party wants to have a future, we need to regain a belief in the American idea. And that means our rights don't come from the state or any leader, but they come from natural law or nature's God. And, politics is downstream from culture. And so if we're fixated on President Trump, we're going to miss the opportunity to really revive what the Republican Party has stood for, what the Party of Lincoln stood for, which is individual freedom. So there's been an ebb and flow in terms of Trump's control of the party this primary cycle. At the beginning of the cycle, it seemed that his popularity was waning to some degree. There was an election in Georgia where the person he backed, lost to Governor Kemp, who he wanted to get rid of because he didn't go along with his election conspiracy theory. But then, of course, Liz Cheney lost, and there's been a number of Republicans who voted for impeachment who lost. But, the proof is really going to come in November. And there are quite a few candidates that President Trump endorsed that may not do as well in November. In Pennsylvania, for example, Georgia, and other states. So I think it remains to be seen whether President Trump is going to look as strong as he does today when voters cast their votes in November.
Yeah, so you just were talking about Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who, of course, lost her primary soundly in Wyoming to a Trump-backed candidate. She was once a member of GOP leadership in the House, and she, of course, is a staunch conservative. And according to 538, she voted in line with Trump nearly 93% of the time while he was actually in office. But, of course, as we know, she voted to impeach him. And as of late, of course, not going along with claims that the election was stolen. So ultimately, she lost. But now she's considering a presidential run, it seems. What are your thoughts on the future for Liz Cheney or conservatives like her in the current Republican Party?
Well, I take some comfort in the fact that when you look back at 2016, 55% of Republicans voted for someone other than Trump. So he doesn't have the stranglehold on the party that he seems to have when you look at just the result of an election like Liz Cheney's. And again, if the Republican Party is going to succeed, we have to understand that the response to the size of government, what motivates a lot of the MAGA voters is this belief that government is too big, government's taking more of our rights, we're marginalized, we don't have a voice. But conservative authoritarianism is not a good response to authoritarianism on the left. And the answer, again, is to revive our belief in our founding principles and the rule of law. The rule of law, the opposite of the rule of law is not anarchy. It's the rule of rulers, where one person has the authority to decide what's true. And that's the central flaw of what former President Trump has argued, is he's made himself a law, unto himself by refusing to accept the results of the election. And then, of course, there's an ongoing investigation about him retaining classified documents. And that's what Republicans have to reject, is if we want to preserve the rights we have under our Constitution, if we want to have a coherent argument against a Democratic Party that chooses to expand the IRS, then we have to reject this rule of rulers and go back to the rule of law. And President Trump is really standing in the way of that, unfortunately.
Go back to the rule of law. All right, GOP strategist John Hart, really appreciate you joining us here. Thank you.
Good luck. Thanks for having me.
Still ahead tonight, the campaign trail post-insurrection. What, if anything, has changed for candidates trying to break through to voters?
And next, changes to voting laws all across the country. What you need to know before casting a ballot. There is very little election fraud. That statement from the top Republican in the Senate, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
That is a fact. As just one of many examples backing this up, the Associated Press looked specifically at 6 swing states in 2020 that President Biden won: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Of the 25.5 million votes cast for president in those states alone, there were less than 475 disputed ballots. Those would have made up a mere 0.15% of Biden's victory margin. But the AP found not all of those ballots were even in favor of Biden, nor were most of them even counted. The report also found no conspiracy to rig voting. But conspiracies about the 2020 election being rigged or stolen have in large part fueled a wave of new voting laws across the country. Newsy's Stephanie Liebergen reports on the changes and their potential impacts on your voting process this fall.
Have your IDs ready to go. Thanks for turning out.
Whether you're going to the polls or mailing in a ballot,
putting the ballot in the envelope,
how you vote this fall could be different thanks to new laws that took effect throughout the country. Since the start of 2021, state legislatures have passed 370 new election-related laws in 49 states. That's according to the Voting Rights Lab database. And some of the most headline-grabbing changes have happened in key swing states.
Many of the states where we saw a lot of conflict or controversy, they have tightened their rules around mail voting, around election certification, and giving the kind of conspiracy theories a lot less ground.
Wisconsin's 2020 election results were heavily scrutinized, and at least one major change will be in effect this November: no more ballot drop boxes. A lawsuit stemming from the 2020 election resulted in a July opinion from the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling drop boxes are illegal. Voting by mail has been one of the biggest targets for change the past 2 years. According to the Voting Rights Lab, 5 states expanded or eliminated the eligibility requirements for voting by mail. 18 states increased the amount of time officials have to process mail-in ballots, and 10 states restricted the rules around returning a ballot for someone else. But Rachel Ory from the Bipartisan Policy Center said she's most concerned about the behind-the-scenes election changes.
They're doing things like adding criminal penalties for mistakes in election administration, making it illegal for an election official to send out an absentee ballot request form to a voter, which is typically a mundane and normal part of the process.
The Voting Rights Lab identified new laws like that in at least 13 states. For example, Arizona made it a felony for election officials to allow same-day registration, even though the practice is already not allowed in the state. Some comprehensive laws, like in Florida and Georgia, have been highly criticized by voting rights advocates. But Ori notes that most of these bills are a mixed bag of changes.
One of the benefits we saw from the recent Georgia election bill was allowing election officials to start to process ballots before Election Day. This is a really important step in making sure that we can get election results quickly and securely on election night.
Election administration was complicated long before any recent changes. So to make sure your vote counts in November, check with your local election officials. They are the best source of information, regardless of whether you want to vote early, vote by mail, or vote on Election Day. Stephanie Lieberman, Newsy.
Joining us now is David Levine, Election Integrity Fellow with the Nonpartisan Initiative Alliance for Securing Democracy. David, big picture here, obviously a lot of changes across the country. What concerns do you have about voting in the midterms?
Sure, Jay. Thanks again for having me. I see three big concerns that I have, right? I think it's important to know that we're in the midst of an assault on U.S. democracy, and a number of bills that have passed have unduly restricted access to the ballot. We've seen a number of states that have enacted rules tightening early voting, making it more difficult to vote by mail, including being able to vote via drop box. And some of these voting options were helped make the 2020 presidential election more successful. Secondly, I'm concerned about election security, and not because of election officials who continue to do yeoman's work, but we saw that when Congress provided even the dribs and drabs of money that they did, we saw states that were able to retire their paperless systems, move to more robust post-election audits, and ensure that their election processes were more secure. And then finally, I'm concerned about trust in the process. Mis and disinformation, particularly from the 2020 election, has fueled a tremendous amount of threats against election officials. It's not only undermined confidence in the process, but has led to a huge number of election officials who have left the profession entirely. And so election security, election access, and election trust are sort of the three big challenges that I see as we get closer and closer to the midterms.
And of course, there are concerns not just about the voting itself. You're touching on a wide range of issues here. There's also the concern about having the votes counted accurately. In the 2020 race, we had some Republican officials, like, for instance, right here in Georgia, the top election official who pushed back against Donald Trump's efforts to overturn results here. Now there's fear there won't be as much resistance going forward. In fact, the Washington Post has been tracking Republican nominees this cycle running in the 2020 battleground states who are election deniers. These are people who, if they would win in November, would have some role in certifying their state's elections. This chart right here shows the percentage of candidates in each of those states who are, in fact, election deniers. When looking at these key states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, 54 out of the 87 candidates are election deniers. That is more than 60%. So, given the massive responsibility these elected positions wield over the actual recording of the votes, what implications could this have for future elections?
Jerry, the implications are huge. I think it's really important to underscore that many of the folks, those 87 folks you mentioned, are involved in setting rules. They're involved in helping certify the results, and they can simply help count the ballots. And it is disheartening, to say the least, that so many are running to oversee the process who don't have a fundamental understanding for how democracy works. Election security is not about when one party wins all the time. Election security is about ensuring that you have a free, fair, and secure process. And there are, frankly, too many folks who are too close to assuming office who don't understand that basic premise.
Bottom line here, looking ahead to November, how confident should voters feel that they will be able to cast their vote with relative ease and that it's going to be counted correctly?
Well, I think one of the things that's important, Jay, is that, many of the folks that you just alluded to are folks who aren't yet in office overseeing elections. We continue to have election officials across the political spectrum that are doing yeoman's work to make sure, right, that the will of the people is being served. And so I think that voters need to make sure they do their job to support election officials. And that means making sure they vote, serving as poll workers, and making sure, of course, that they are supporting those that put free and fair elections above any partisan or personal interests.
David Levine, Election Integrity Fellow with Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, still ahead, presidential approval. How President Biden's poll numbers are factoring into this election cycle, even though his name isn't on the ballot. Welcome back. On the home stretch to the midterms, President Biden is seeing a bit of an uptick in his approval rating.
A Gallup poll released just this past week shows his approval among Americans is at 44%. That is actually up from his record low of 38% last month. It's also the highest he's polled in a year.
But taking into account a number of polls, Political Analysis Group 538 has Biden around the same approval rating this far into his presidency as former President Trump. It's lower than former President Obama and far lower than former President George W. Bush.
Newsy White House correspondent Willie James Inman has more on the president standing right now with the public and within his own party.
Well, midterm elections are often seen as a referendum on the president, and with President Joe Biden's low approval ratings, Democrats have just been bracing for the worst come this November. But some Democrats are seeing a small silver lining in recent polling and are optimistic about their chances this fall. Following a series of legislative wins in recent weeks, President Biden will soon hit the road to tout what the White House and Democrats see as major accomplishments in the first half of his term.
And I'm about to sign the Inflation Reduction Act into law, one of the most significant laws in our history. Let me say from the start, with this law, the American people won and the special interests lost.
But the big question is, will it be enough to push back political headwinds and the president's low approval ratings to propel Democrats to success this fall?
We know historically the party that's in power, as represented by which party is in control of the White House, tends to lose seats in a midterm election. So Democrats are bracing to lose seats in the House and in the Senate.
While the president has seen his popularity increase slightly in recent weeks, his standing among voters is still at historic lows, and it could drag Democrats down with him this November. But some in the president's party now see a rare silver lining after Biden signed major legislation on things like infrastructure, gun reform, and more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, which Democrats say will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lower healthcare costs for Americans.
We've done a lot. Have we done everything? But we've done enough, more so than any other president in modern day history when you look at what Joe Biden has accomplished legislative-wise and policy-wise. That's number one.
Democrats are in part focusing their message on abortion rights and legislative wins, while Republicans work to seize an opportunity to attack the president's record amid historically high inflation with messaging like this.
Prices are up. The economy is weak. Maine families are drowning. But instead of helping, Jared Golden cast one of the deciding votes for Biden's new massive spending bill.
Republicans say voters are just ready for a change.
We're working incredibly hard. Republicans, the RNC, our sister committees, we are not taking a single thing for granted. We know that Americans are struggling under Biden's failed administration.
Both Republican and Democratic national committees boast an army of volunteers and operatives aimed at motivating key groups of voters in states that could decide which party controls Congress.
There are very few persuadable people in the electorate right now. Most people probably have a good idea of whether or not they're voting for Democrats versus Republicans in the election. The bigger issue for Democrats is to make sure that they mobilize as much as possible. And this is true for Republicans as well.
Jay and Lindsay, just a little bit more about that ground game that we're talking about here. Republicans tell me they've opened up more than 35 community centers aimed at certain minority groups, aimed to boost their turnout come the midterm election. Democrats, meanwhile, say they have not only hired in select states in terms of their staffing, they are also putting their money behind key ad campaigns, both nationally and in select states, that could likely determine the balance of power. Back to you.
All right, let's continue this discussion now with political analyst Dr. Lauren Wright. She's an associate research scholar and lecturer at Princeton University. Dr. Wright, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, whether it's abortion rights or gun reform, the economy, or education, are those specific issues big enough to supersede the importance of how voters feel specifically about the job that President Biden has done so far?
Well, the job President Biden has done so far is going to, no matter what, and it happens in every single election, be hinged heavily on how the economy is doing and whether we're involved in any foreign conflict. You can predict a lot of election outcomes that way, at least in a presidential election. So any of those specific issues you just mentioned, I don't think will supersede the importance of inflation and the economy and gas prices, these closely linked issues that people deal with on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't mean that Democrats don't have some things to campaign on with abortion, for instance. Republicans' position on that, overturning Roe v. Wade, is very unpopular with most of the country.
Let's talk about the campaigning itself. This will be the first midterm election since the January 6th attack on the Capitol. How much, if at all, have the dynamics of campaigning itself changed from the last midterms in 2018 to now? Are you noticing any particular trends in how the two parties are trying to appeal to voters?
So one thing that has happened a lot in recent decades is that even these very specific congressional elections have become highly nationalized. And so one of my colleagues, Dan Hopkins at UPenn, studies this very closely. And what it just means is that when people think about voting for a House seat, maybe it's a very specific district, sometimes those issues do become more linked to the president. They do become more linked to national debates, even if those debates are very far away from the day-to-day concerns of voters in that district. So we've seen that, but there's also some underlying realities that have been there for a while. And one of them, of course, is that the president's party typically loses seats, about 26 on average in a midterm election. And so some of that will be probably pretty typical in November.
All right, political analyst Dr. Lauren Wright, appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Jay.
So, is the USA a flawed democracy? And has the country truly ever been in a position like this before? We get historical perspective when this Newsy special continues. Okay, the state of democracy globally apparently suffered the biggest annual drop from 2020 to 2021 since the aftermath of the Great Recession. This according to the Democracy Index report from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Norway, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland are the world's top-ranked democracies, according to this index. The U.S. notably not making the cut.
In fact, the report considers the U.S. a flawed democracy. It bases these ratings on 5 categories: the electoral process, civil liberties, the functioning of government, political participation, and political culture.
Historians just this month actually warned President Biden in a private meeting about U.S. democracy being in a precarious position. The Washington Post reports most of the people Biden met with are particularly concerned following the Capitol insurrection and election denial in general within the Republican Party.
Joining us now is presidential historian and author Mike Purdy. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening. Can you give us historical perspective, whether in the U.S. or another democracy, to help better understand where we are as a country right now and perhaps what we can learn from the past?
Well, that's a great question. I think where we're at historically is we're at a point where we've never been before, and we are facing a potential constitutional crisis. Certainly, we've had moments in our history that have been crisis moments, the times leading up to the Civil War and the Civil War, where you've got Americans fighting against one another. We could look at Watergate, and during the time of Watergate, of course, we said that that was a constitutional crisis. The process worked then, and I think as we look back from today's perspective at Watergate, we would say Watergate is almost child's play. What we're dealing with now, of course, is something unprecedented, where we have a former president who is under multiple investigations, grand jury investigations, and has the potential to be indicted. So not that indictment in and of itself, I mean, that would be unprecedented, certainly. But what makes it more challenging and more of a crisis, I think, for our nation is the potential response of supporters of former President Trump. And we've seen some violence that's already ensued after the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago. And we have had the FBI had additional threats. The National Archives has been subject to violent threats. So we are at a point where we are waiting and wanting to let the process play out. John Adams reminded us that we are a nation of laws and not men. And that, of course, is something that's going to be challenged in the days ahead.
Something you mentioned when you were listing those historical examples was that the process worked. So if we're going to jump ahead 20 years, 30 years, 100 years into the future, do you think we'll look back and say the process worked again? What's kind of your future perspective if we're going to look back into history many years from now? Are you optimistic about how history will perceive this time?
Well, I'm a historian, not a futurist, but I would hope that we would look back and we would say the process worked. We have, I think what the founding fathers developed is a good system, but it's a system that is dependent upon the goodwill of people. And so we certainly hope that looking back, 20, 50, 100 years from the future back to now, that we hope that we would say, yes, the process worked. But, that's the thing about history. We live in the moment and we don't know how things are going to unfold.
And we certainly are waiting to find out how they do unfold. All right, presidential historian Mike Purdy, as always, appreciate you being here. Thanks.
My pleasure.
And still to come tonight, inflation, education, abortion rights, immigration. What's on the mind of voters? And do they plan on turning out come November?
All right, welcome back. So we've heard what the politicians have to say heading into November, and the pundits.
But what about the people themselves? Newsy's Alex Miller breaks down what is on the minds of voters.
After a summer of economic turmoil, headline-grabbing hearings, and a bombshell Supreme Court ruling, figuring out which issue will be most important to voters in November could tell us which party controls Congress in 2023.
I'm really, scared at the way we've been going.
Polling shows the economy is the top issue on voters' minds right now, and by a large margin.
That's about it. After COVID, it's been tough, so hoping that the economy turns to take a turn for the better.
Topics like women's rights and immigration are distantly behind the economy. But once you look at priorities by party, things start to change. Republicans see two major issues as important, where Democrats are more split on their motivations. GOP voters are focused particularly on inflation and immigration, while Democrats have a much longer list, including gun violence, abortion, and inflation. The political climate may be breaking in the Democrats' favor after positive economic signs and legislative victories. Quinnipiac polling from late July shows a slight increase in voter desire for Democrats to keep control. Meanwhile, election security remains a top concern for Democrats like Wyoming voter Mike Calabrese.
The ability of legislatures to tinker with the machines afterwards or to throw out electors. But that's a serious national issue, not just a local issue.
But in the end, all politics is local. He's been a Wyomingite for nearly half a century and is concerned about the environment, public land use, state funding of schools, and of course, taxes. And if you zip down to Florida, you'll find pretty much the same.
Focusing on spending more money in Florida and not wasting money outside the country, and helping people with tax cuts, especially during this tough times.
Florida voters are also concerned about the changes Americans are seeing to the education system.
The school stuff is really freaking me out about that they're not allowed to read certain books. When you start taking books off the shelf, it's a scary thing. There's got to be another way.
And with an unexpected twist, more than half of Americans saying they're more enthusiastic than usual about voting, you can expect candidates up and down the ballot to be pushing their get out the vote messages to ensure all their supporters get to the polls this November. Alex Miller, Newsy, New York.
Coming up, high stakes for both Republicans and Democrats. What party leaders are focused on a state level to win control of Congress. Stay with us.
Welcome back. We'll end tonight where we started, with 72 days until November 8th. And just how important does each party see this midterm election?
Follow the money. Our Joe St. George takes a look.
Like it or not, November 8th, Election Day, is quickly approaching. And right now, key decisions are being made by the leaders of the Democratic and Republican parties on where to spend the money and on which candidates.
You know, voting happens in every single county across the country, but the reality is control of this place is decided by a handful of states.
So where are the Senate races to watch in 2022? Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are all states that are considered the biggest toss-ups this year for the U.S. Senate. The most money will be spent in those states. Places like Colorado and New Hampshire favor Democrats, but many Republicans think they could win there too. As a result, plenty of cash will be spent there as well. Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio all lean Republican based on polls, but some Democrats think they have a chance. And as a result, big fundraisers and big checks are being written there, too.
This midterm election will be the most expensive in those states. One estimate has $8.8 billion expected to be spent on this year's campaign. For perspective, the last big midterm in 2018, $3.9 billion was spent. In Washington, I'm Joe St. George.
That is a lot of money. I'm Jay Strubberg.
And I'm Lindsay Tuchman. Thanks for joining us for this Newsy special, Election 22, America at a Crossroad.
Have a great night.